Hello, this is a story called The Blaeberry Girl. Now you've probably heard of blueberries, but this is about blaeberries, and blaeberries are like a little tiny blueberry. This is a story about a wee girl who lived with her granny in a cottage, and on the hillside behind the cottage there grew lots and lots of blaeberries on lots and lots of bushes. Now it was a fine hot summer's day, and Granny sent the wee girl out to pick the blaeberries, and she went away off with a wee bucket up the hillside to pick the berries. And she picked them like this: one for the bucket and one for me. And she'd pop one of the sour, sweet little berries into her mouth. And then she'd pick two for the bucket and two for me. And she'd pop two into her mouth. And so it went on, and she picked the whole day long. But it was hot and it was thirsty work. And she knew that there was a little stream at the side of the hillside where she could get a nice, long, cool drink. So she went over to the stream, and she knelt down and she filled her cupped hands with water, and she was about to take a drink when she heard a little voice, and it was singing. And the voice was singing, diddly-dee, diddly-dee, diddly-dee-dee-dee. And she looked around, but there was nobody there. Now that little girl was clever, and her granny was a wise old woman, and she had told her a lot of stories. So she had a fair idea who the little voice might be coming from. So she knelt down again, and she cupped her hands, and she was just about to drink the water when the little voice came again, diddly-dee, diddly-dee, diddly-diddly-dee. And she looked around, but it was gone. Well, she tried a third time, and this time she knelt down, she cupped the water in her hands, but she waited and she listened. And when the little voice came, diddly-dee, diddly-dee, she put her hand round and she grabbed it and she brought her hand up to her face, and there was a little man in it. Now this little man, he had a long scraggly beard, and he was wearing a little old-fashioned tweed suit. You might have guessed. It was a leprechaun. And the wee leprechaun was struggling in her hand, saying, put me down, unhand me, you monster. But as I said, that little girl was a clever little girl, and she knew that wherever there was a leprechaun, that nearby there would be a pot of gold. So the wee girl said to the leprechaun, I'll put you down if you tell me where your pot of gold is. The wee leprechaun, he spluttered and he spluttered, and his face went bright red. He didn't want to say. But you see, leprechauns are not allowed to lie. And they're not allowed to lie by not telling the truth. And the wee girl knew that. Tell me where your pot of gold is. And the wee man spluttered. He says, it's over there, under a blaeberry bush. Well, the little girl looked around, and of course there were lots and lots of blaeberry bushes. You'll have to tell me which one, she said. So she carried the wee leprechaun in her hand round the hillside, and at every bush she stopped and she said, is it under this bush? And the wee man, he spluttered and said, no. And she went to the next bush and the next and the next, until finally she came to a bush, and the wee leprechaun said, yes, it's this one. Now put me down. Well, the wee girl was about to put the leprechaun down, but she had a thought. She knew that in order to dig the bush up, she would have to go back to her granny's cottage and fetch a spade. So So she said to the wee man, "I'll put you down if you promise not to move the bush." I promise, said the wee leprechaun. "And you have to promise not to move the pot of gold." I promise, he said. "Now put me down, put me down." But the wee girl realized that there were so many bushes that how would she remember which one it was when she came back with the spade? So she held the wee leprechaun up to her head and she said, "Untie the ribbon on my ponytail." The wee leprechaun, he untied it and she said, "Now tie it around the bush." And the wee leprechaun tied it around the bush. And then, satisfied, she put the wee leprechaun down and pop, he disappeared quick as a flash, and she went back to fetch the spade. Well, when she came back, she started digging and digging at that bush with the spade. And I don't know if you've ever tried it, but digging up bushes is quite hard work. But she kept on digging and digging and digging until finally the bush was out of the ground, roots and all. But there was no pot of gold. Well, the wee girl, she was sweating by this stage, and she straightened up to wipe her brow with the sweat, and she looked around and she realized that there was a wee blue ribbon on all the bushes. And that was the one thing she hadn't made the leprechaun promise not to do. But she didn't give up. She went on digging up bushes all day until half of that field was lying with the bushes and the roots up in the air. But do you think she found a pot of gold? No, there was no pot of gold to be found. And you know, it took a long time for those bushes to grow back, and they never did taste as sweet as they had before after all that digging. And she never did get her pot of gold. But what I would say is this, that if you're out playing in the countryside and you meet a wee leprechaun and you think you're going to get a pot of gold out of him, well, think again, because the leprechauns are very clever too. And that's the story.